Hello, this is All 24 News, special coverage on the Russia-Ukraine file coming to you live from Algiers. I'm your host, Kirifa Zachary. Here's what's on tap today. Explosions rocked Kiev Sunday morning, a day after a flurry of missiles struck targets across Ukraine. Meanwhile, Russian troops took full control of the key eastern industrial hub of Severodonetsk, which was under heavy siege for several weeks. Leaders of the Group of Seven, G7, are meeting on Sunday in the Bavarian Alps in Germany for the first day of their three-day annual summit. The 7 working sessions of the summit will focus on various topics: global economy, partnerships for developing countries, foreign and security policy, sustainability, food security, multilateralism, and digital transformation. Their aim is to mitigate the impacts of Russia's war against Ukraine. To talk more about these developments and other pressing issues, I am joined live via Skype by Dr. Matthew Gotteland, a PhD holder in History of International Relations and geopolitical analyst from Poland, along with Georgi Katsitadze, State and International Security Analyst from Georgia. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us. The discussion begins right after this short break. So let's kick it off with the updates. The G7 summit hosted by this year's German G7 presidency is taking place from the 26th to the 28th of June. The leaders of the G7 countries, Canada, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United Kingdom, and the United States, are advocating for progress, prosperity, peace, and security, as well as solidarity and close cooperation to ease the impacts of Russia's war against Ukraine. Well, Macron agreed to provide more support for Ukraine in its war with Russia. And during a bilateral meeting with the German Chancellor, US President Joe Biden says that the G7 and NATO must stick together against Russian aggression on Ukraine.
Thank you. We have to stay together. Yeah. Because Putin has been counting on from the beginning. And somehow NATO would and the G7 would splinter, but we haven't, and we're not going to. So can't let this aggression take the form it has and get away with it.
Mr. Georgi Katsitadze, the G7 leaders are expected to seek or to stick to a show of united front on supporting Ukraine for as long as necessary and cranking up pressure on the Kremlin, although they will want to avoid sanctions that could stoke inflation and exacerbate the cost of living crisis affecting their own people. What are we to expect from this meeting? What's the main message from the G7, according to you? Apparently, Mr. Georgi Katsitadze is having a problem fixing his camera. Maybe I could address the question to Matthew Gotteland. Mr. Matthew Gotteland?
What we can expect is probably sanctions on gold exports, minerals exports from Russia, which are mainly directed to the Western market, particularly the UK. So that's one thing President Biden was adamant about. And certainly also reconstruction funds for Ukraine, which are badly needed for after the war. Beyond that, I don't think there will be bigger announcements on sanctions against Russia.
Mm-hmm. Moving on, Professor Matthew Gotteland, on another question, President Biden said that the world's wealthiest democracies would ban imports of Russian gold as their summit in Germany sought ways to further isolate Moscow. How will the consequences of the ban affect Russia, according to you? And is President Putin ready to face new sanctions that will cripple the Russian economy for sure? Mr. Matthew?
No. Yes, I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. No, Putin is not ready to face new sanctions, and sanctions on gold are probably the most effective, except the ones on gas right now. But most sanctions the West could apply against Russia have already been applied. So I shouldn't expect that economic sanctions will help end the war more than they had already.
Okay, very nice indeed. And now we see these sanctions perhaps are affecting directly, are having like direct effects on the average EU citizen. As an EU citizen, how do you see these sanctions? Do you think that perhaps there is a better effective way to deal with Russia apart from these sanctions that have exacerbated the living cost conditions in general across the UA or the EU, sorry? Mr. Matthew?
I think the inflation linked to the sanctions is a necessary evil for EU to bear, at least on the short term. But that will not bring peace. That is a question of fairness, but that will not be enough to bring Russia out of Ukraine.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Mr. Georgi Katitadze? How do you see the sanctions that could still curb inflation and exacerbate the cost of living crisis affecting EU citizens?
Yes, that's true. It's really hard decision for European Union country also, the collective West, to impose the severe sanctions on Russia. It's also pretty damaging for their economies, but this is the only way to somehow, as the Charles Michel mentioned today during the meeting, to cut the oxygen, the Russian war machine.
Mm-hmm. And how do you see the big questions looming over the talks in Germany and Spain? Most importantly, whether the united Western response to the conflict can be sustained, particularly as leaders face the threat of a global recession and growing anger at home over rising prices for gas, food, and other goods. What do you think about that?
So unfortunately, there's a problem regarding internet. Could you please repeat the question? Because
Yes, I said there are a lot of big questions looming ahead. For instance, the threat of a global recession, economic recession that is, and growing anger at home over rising prices for gas, food, and other goods. What do you think in general about that? Mr. Georgi?
yeah, generally, one of the main problems for the world's economy and also the hunger will be weaponizing the grain from Ukraine, which Russia is doing now. They need to give the access to Ukraine and other countries to export the grain from Ukraine mainly, and also not to use third world countries and poor countries to jeopardize the West and the Ukraine mainly. And this probably will be for this summer and autumn. The fall will be a biggest challenge for Ukraine mainly and generally for the world. The world hunger, I mean, yes.
Mm-hmm. And is there any party here to blame concerning the crisis that, especially the food crisis here, because we've seen the West trying to portray this problem as though it's the direct impact of the Ukraine war, although the crisis existed there before Mr. Matthew got to land. Mr. Matthew?
Well, certainly the actions of Russia and Ukraine made the problem worse, much worse. The blockade of the Black Sea by Russia and the stealing of Ukrainian cereals by Russia certainly made the crisis worse.
All right. So maybe we can follow this report and then we get back to discussion. Russian missiles struck the Ukrainian capital Kiev on Sunday, a day after a key eastern city fell to pro-Russian forces in a major setback for Ukraine, and as world leaders gathered in Europe to discuss further sanctions against Moscow. Let's follow the report and then we get back to discussion.
Spared for 3 weeks from shelling, the Ukrainian capital Kiev is once again a target of missile strikes. Ukraine's capital woke up at dawn with 4 explosions hitting a residential area. The shelling caused this 9-story building to burn, 5 people to be wounded, while others remain under the rebels.
We listen the voices under the crash, and we know the couple of people inside.
In the Donbass, the strategic city of Severodonetsk, a witness of the war's bloodiest fights, has fallen in the hands of the Russians. Another victory for Moscow after it took control of Mariupol. A success crowned with medals from the Russian defense minister who visited his forces in Ukraine.
I have faith in you. You have many more glorious deeds ahead for the good of our homeland. Armed forces and airborne troops, I congratulate you. Take care.
And there in Moscow, the Russian leader received one of his most close allies, Alexander Lukashenko. Vladimir Putin announced that his country would in the coming months deliver to Belarus nuclear-capable short-range missile systems, a message understood by the West that the price of any intervention will be high.
We have made a decision. Within the next few months, we will hand over to Belarus the Iskander-M tactical missile systems, which, as you know, can use both ballistic and cruise missiles, both in conventional and nuclear versions.
In the wake of the 5th month of the conflict, Russia has achieved significant military achievements in eastern Ukraine. Meanwhile, NATO, ahead of its important summit in Madrid, warns the West that it must prepare to continue supporting Ukraine in a war lasting for years.
Mr. Georgy Katsitadze, Russia unleashed a new round of missiles at Kiev on Sunday, the fast attack on the Ukrainian capital in weeks, an apparent show of defiance as the G7 summit opened today, Sunday. What's your comment on Russia's step here? How is Ukraine and its allies going to react to such a move?
First of all, I would like to mention that on Friday, Severodonetsk finally fell into the Russian hands. It opened the road to Lysychansk and, of course, the further supposed encirclement forces of Ukraine in the east parts of Ukraine. I think this attack on Kiev, it has no point in military aims. It was just a reminder that Russia is still there, Russia is still strong. Just before the G7 meeting, it was kind of, again, I would like to mention the reminder for the West that Russia is still strong and is capable of firing the missiles.
Don't you think perhaps it is a message that maybe it could escalate the war and target the capital here, maybe making or marking a shift in the targets and objectives of Russia here?
According to the intelligence sources, the Russian military is not in a shape to reopen the attack on Kiev and also the other fronts of the Ukraine. In a couple of months, at the end of summer, I think they will be incapable of conduct strong attacks on Ukraine, especially in Donbas region. So that's why they're trying their best to seize control in Donbas region, at least the half of it, and then try to maintain and regroup and maintain the gains over the possessed by them in the east and southern part of the country.
What about you, Professor Matthew Gauntlin? The U.S. President Joe Biden said Russian airstrikes in Kiev were more of their barbarism. Biden was responding to a question by reporters at the G7 summit about Russian strikes that hit residential buildings in Kiev this morning for the first time in weeks. How do you find these attacks? Can you tell us perhaps your insights about this development? Are we talking about a shift in the objectives of Russia?
No, I don't think so. This is a big classic of Russian so-called diplomacy that before Western leaders visited Kyiv or before President of Belarus Lukashenko visited Putin in Moscow, there were similar attacks or false flag attacks in Belarus also. There is nothing new.
And how does your country, Poland, find this aggression against Ukraine? Does it have any fears that perhaps it could expand into its own borders? Especially, I mean, seeing the NATO build-up in Poland, and Vladimir Putin did make comments about this build-up, and he said that perhaps they will find an adequate response. What do you think he means by that?
Well, it's saber-rattling. Poland is part of the EU, is part of NATO, and honestly, I don't think Russia will go any further.
And don't you think that perhaps the NATO build-up inside Poland could be a provocation for Russia to do so?
I don't think it would be enough for Russia to risk an attack on Polish territory now.
Very nice indeed. Moving on now, as Russian and Ukrainian forces fought for control of several important cities and villages in the Luhansk and Donetsk regions, hundreds of people continued to leave the intense battles in eastern Ukraine. The majority of refugees boarding the train at Prokhorovsk are from cities such as Severodonetsk, Slovensk, Bakhmut, and Popasna, where Russian forces are concentrating their operation to take over the Donbas region. Mr. Georgi Katsitadze, the military situation in eastern Ukraine is even worse than people say it is. Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba has said as Russian forces continue to thrust ahead in the Donbas from a humanitarian point of view, what could be done in this situation? Mr. Georgi?
From the humanitarian point of perspective, it's really important. Yes. Do you hear me now?
Yes. Yes.
Unfortunately, it's really bad internet connection today for no reason. From the humanitarian point of perspective, it's really important to at least sides need to agree to give the permission and the ability local civilians to move in more fire-free regions, or at least to leave the city unharmed. But it was really difficult practice. We had in Mariupol, cities and villages, especially in southern part of the country. So now Russians trying to cross the Severodonetsk river and attack Lysychansk. Lysychansk is located on the high ground, and it will be pretty difficult to attack from the eastern part. That's why they try to kind of circle from the Liman side and also the Propasna side and attack the city from the west part. But it will be really difficult because the city is still full of the local people and civilians. Also, people trying to evacuate and leave the Slaviansk, which is the last bastion of the Donbas region in this area. And let's see the further developments. If the Russian army is capable to at least encircle the Lysychansk and then continue the attacking phase towards Slaviansk. So it will be really difficult. But unfortunately, Ukrainian forces are lack of counter attack because of the mainly civilian population still presence on the territory, so they could not use everywhere the artillery. That's the main problem that caused the casualties in the civilians.
And how do you explain the retreat from the Ukrainian forces? We see just recently Vladimir Zelensky actually pleaded more weapons or Western support regarding heavy weaponry as the strikes continue in the eastern region, and then we see Ukrainian forces retrieving from there. How do you explain this retreat? Is it something strategic perhaps, or maybe there is a defeat in the battlefield here?
Pretty clearly, frankly speaking, we can say that Ukraine changed the approach a little bit. They deliberately raised the asked weapon to deliver them quickly to put pressure on the West Western allies to give them additional weapon in way more faster and in a short time period. And also they deliberately, from my point of perspective, and the others also, my colleagues will agree, that they said that in the last couple of days that in every day Ukraine lost from 200 to 300 battle-hardened veterans. It's a huge amount of number of soldiers. Of course, we think that it's not true, but also it's raised the pressure on Western allies to give the Ukraine more heavy weapons, especially artillery, HIMARS, and other artillery pieces, howitzers, in a more short time period. General retreat from the Severodonetsk, excuse me. It was the calculated step. There was no point to hold the only western part of the city, and also it was pretty hard to defend the region because the city was completely destroyed by the shelling from Russian side, and as we seen previously, there was no uncalculated steps from the Ukrainian military. So they withdrew in order and reduced casualties. And also they conducted successful counterattacks in Izium side. It's northwest side of Dolina and Krasnopolia cities in the west part of Donbass, and close to Kharkiv. We can say that it's calculated, and it doesn't mean that any major defeat in the battlegrounds.
Okay, what about you, Professor Matthew Gartiland? Ukrainian forces are bracing for another bitter fight in neighboring Donetsk province. Citizens are forced to flee their houses, leaving all their properties behind.
I agree. I think Severodonetsk was indefensible, and the main aim of the Ukrainians in Severodonetsk was to hurt the Russian army as much as they could and kill as many soldiers as they could, and then retreat. The city was encircled, the bridges were destroyed, and strategically, the city is not that important. So now the focus will be on Lysychansk, which will be much easier to defend, and we'll see where we go from there. But Severodonetsk was not an important strategic objective, and I think we should watch more closely what happens around Kharkiv and in the west around Kherson, where the Ukrainians are 20 kilometers from the city.
And don't you think that perhaps Ukrainian forces, Ukrainian government is living in denial, seeing that there is a defeat after defeat? Perhaps Russia is advancing slowly, but surely taking over the most important strategic cities there. And we see perhaps the recurrent and the different pleas from Volodymyr Zelensky for Western weapons actually reassures the Russian forces that they are actually gaining in the ground. I mean, when you have Volodymyr Zelensky every single time saying that the situation is difficult and we need more weapons, perhaps this is reassuring for Russia that it is actually doing good on the battlefield. What do you think?
From President Zelensky, it's only good politics to use the events on the ground to ask for more weapons and to combat emotional fatigue in the West regarding the war. But it is too soon to talk about defeat or victory on either side for now.
Following Russia's control of the Severodonetsk, the Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said sanctions against Russia are not enough. He called for more help as his country faces a fierce fighting in the east of Ukraine.
The sanctions against Russia are not enough. Ukraine needs more help with armaments. The air defense systems, the modern systems that our partners have, should not be in sites or in warehouses, but in Ukraine, where they are now needed. They are needed here more than anywhere else in the world.
Back to you, Mr. Georgi Katsitadze. Zelensky appeals for more sanctions and more military assistance from the West. What is expected from Russia about this, knowing that the leaders are increasing pressure on Moscow, or Western leaders are all the time increasing pressure on Moscow? Is there something for Moscow to do to retaliate? Mr. Georgi, are you with me?
As I understand your question,
Okay.
I think, do you hear me now?
Yes.
Great. As I understand your question, you're asking about is there any other way from Russian side to retaliate the ever-increasing pressure from the West, right?
Yes, absolutely.
I think they need to act quickly from the Russian point of perspective. Should conduct offensive military operations, especially in summer when the ground is pretty hard, dry. And we will see. But from my point of perspective, from our analysis, from our colleagues, Russian military capabilities is pretty severely damaged after the first huge casualties from the February and in March. And consumed artillery shells, it's not easy to replace, especially even for the Russian. But ever increasing military aid from the West, and especially in July, in August, probably the Lend-Lease agreement will go into full force. So then it will be easier for Ukrainian military to conduct counter-attacking military operations. Then we will see the real results for the Ukraine, actually. If the Russian is to achieve some strategic victories in the Donbas region, they need to capture Slavyansk. But before that, they need to cut at least the two main highways, TO 513 and other which is goes to Lysychansk from Bakhmut. This is the main highways and the roads for supplies and military aids for the Ukrainian forces. So we will see in the next, probably next 2 weeks.
Very nice indeed. What about you, Professor Matthew Gotteland? Many countries of the global south are concerned about the collateral damage from Western sanctions. An EU official said G7 countries would impress upon the partner countries that food price spikes hitting them were the result of Russia's actions and that there were no sanctions targeting food. How is the world reacting to the hike in food prices, and how is this war affecting the poorer countries, according to you?
Of course, it is affecting it, mainly because of Russia's actions in Ukraine, mainly because of the stealing of cereals, because of the targeting of agricultural installations, because of the blockade of the Black Sea, of course. But also, and Macky Sall said so in Moscow, their sanctions are targeting fertilizers from Belarus and Russia. And it is important that the West should help the global South on this particular issue and about other ways to bring food to the countries who need it most.
And on our final info, tens of thousands of Georgians resumed pro-EU rallies in the capital, Tbilisi, in front of the parliament building. Protesters demanded the resignation of the prime minister after the country was not given candidate status by the European Union, while making Ukraine and Moldova candidates for EU membership. So as the final question, Mr. Georgi Katsitadze, as we wrap up the show, few took it seriously when Georgia's ruling party promised to formally apply for EU membership in 2024, but then events pushed them to apply even earlier. Is Georgia ready, according to you? And why the war-torn Ukraine is admitted this candidate status and Georgia not?
First of all, it needs to be mentioned that none of the three Eastern partner countries, Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia, are not ready for the full membership of the European Union. But geopolitical situation has changed rapidly in the last 4 months, and that's why we gave European Union and the West gave us chance to apply prematurely and at least, to frankly speaking, try our luck. Many years, Georgia was the leading from these three countries. And it was on the first place between the European Union potential membership and in comparison with the other countries. But it's really difficult to manage ongoing occupation. So that's why it's pretty hard to continue make changes. Do you hear me now?
Mr. Georgi. Thank you so much, Mr. Georgi. We have reached the end of our show. Thank you, dear guests, for your thorough analysis. And thank you, dear viewers, for keeping it here on All 24 News. Bye for now.